The wedding was 6 hours old when the groom stood up in the Kennedy compound at Hyannisport and raised a glass to the wrong man. It was the 26th of April, 1986, late afternoon, the lawn behind the big house still streaked with the light that photographers from all over the country had come to chase. 500 guests. Oprah Winfrey had read at the church. Caroline Kennedy stood beside the bride as maid of honor. Franco Columbu, the Sardinian powerlifter who had lifted beside the groom in Munich and Columbus and Gold's Gym in the old days, stood beside him. Andy Warhol was somewhere in the crowd with a camera. And the groom, who had been in America for 18 years and in the movies for almost as long, picked up his glass and toasted Kurt Waldheim. Not his new father-in-law, not the bride, not the dead Kennedys whose compound he was standing in. The former United Nations Secretary General, who was at that exact moment running for President of Austria, and who had just been identified by the World Jewish Congress as someone whose wartime record in the Balkans was not what he had claimed. Waldheim was not in the room. He had sent a gift. The toast was the point. It would be the only time in that marriage's public life when someone on the groom's side made the news. Years later, during a campaign for governor of California in 2003, his spokesman Rob Stutzman would tell the Los Angeles Times that the candidate would not have given that toast if he had known then what he knows now. Schwarzenegger himself, asked about it by the Jewish Journal the same September, would call it a mistake. The toast was never denied. It was only re-described again and again by a man who understood that the room a person steps into belongs to whoever is willing to speak first. On the lawn that day, with the Kennedys looking on and the bride's mother watching from a few feet away, he had spoken first, and the room had been his. The bride, meanwhile, had been a working network journalist for almost a decade. She was 30 at the wedding. Her name was Maria Shriver. She had been born in Chicago in November of 1955, the second child and only daughter of Eunice Kennedy Shriver and Sargent Shriver, with 4 younger brothers behind her. Her mother founded what became the Special Olympics in 1968 when Maria was 12. Her father had run the Peace Corps, run the War on Poverty, run as the vice presidential nominee on the George McGovern ticket in 1972, and run his own, quieter presidential campaign in 1976 that did not last. Her uncle, the president, had been killed in Dallas when she was 8. Her uncle Bobby had been killed in Los Angeles when she was 12. The household she grew up in was a household that knew what assassinations looked like and what they cost and what kind of adults children had to become to keep living in the houses they left. She had gone to Georgetown, where she studied American Studies and graduated in the class of 1977. Her first job was a news writer and producer's seat at KYW in Philadelphia, then a producer's job on Evening Magazine in Baltimore. By 1983, she was a national correspondent for CBS. A short time later, she was a co-anchor of CBS Morning News, the youngest woman to hold that chair on a major network. The Kennedy in her name was, at that point, almost beside the point. She had built a job in the room where news was made by going to work. They met at a tennis tournament in 1977 at the Robert F. Kennedy Pro Celebrity Tennis event that her mother's family ran as a charity. She was 21, just out of college. He was 30, a former Mr. Olympia and the new star of a documentary called Pumping Iron, in America since 1968, with very little in his pockets and a near-perfect sense of what to do with a room. Tom Brokaw is generally credited with the introduction in the recollections that have made it into print. They were together, in the public record and in the long family timeline, for about 8 years before the wedding. Each of them had a reason. She was the only daughter of a family that understood how to be looked at, and he was a man who understood how to be looked at better than almost anyone alive. He had a name in 2 languages by then, but he did not have the kind of name that opened the front doors of American politics. She had those doors. Her family's doors, her mother's door especially, were the widest in democratic America, and they were hung on a frame that a Republican from a small village in Styria had never had access to before. He did not marry a woman. He married in the dress book. There were also, before the wedding, about a year of tabloid noise. In the middle of the 1980s, he had filmed Red Sonja in Europe and had an affair with his co-star, Brigitte Nielsen. He has admitted this himself in his 2012 memoir. The affair did not stop the proposal, which came in Austria in the summer of 1985, beside a lake he had swum in as a boy. She said yes. They were married on April 26, 1986, at St. Francis Xavier Church in Hyannis, and the reception was held at the family compound. 500 people. Caroline Kennedy as maid of honor, Franco Colombo at his side, Oprah Winfrey as the reader, Grace Jones somewhere in the room, Andy Warhol with a camera, whose wedding day images are now held in the Warhol Photography Archive at Stanford, along with a portrait he gave the couple as a gift. The Waldheim toast. The honeymoon was brief. Within months of the wedding, she left CBS and moved across the network divide to NBC. In 1989, she gave birth to the first of their 4 children. The fourth, Christopher, was born in September of 1997. The marriage, on paper, had everything. A husband whose films were among the highest grossing in the world, a wife whose own career sat on top of one of the 3 American networks, 4 children, 2 families, 1 church in April, 1 lawn in Hyannisport. There was also a decision, made in the first year, that the public would not see for almost 2 decades. She moved west to California. That is the structural fact. The Waldheim toast is the prologue the marriage wrote for itself on a Saturday afternoon in April. The Kennedy wife who survives in the popular image is a fragment of the woman who actually walked out of that church. The journalist is the part that the deal was made with, and the journalist is also the part the deal was going to cost. He had his films, his gyms, his magazine covers, his American life. She had a job in New York that asked her to be in a chair at a certain hour every morning and to keep looking like herself. They could not both have what they had. So they moved to Los Angeles. So the chair was given up. So she raised 4 children, ran a household, and waited, the way a great many women in politics-adjacent marriages have waited, for the next phase of his life to begin. The house in Brentwood ran the way a house runs when there is money and a public calendar and 4 children whose names will eventually be known. There was a staff, there were routines. A long-term housekeeper, her name has never been a useful part of the public story, and it will not be made useful now, was employed in the household for roughly 20 years. She was part of the architecture. The family photographs from the 1990s and early 2000s show her at the edge of the frame sometimes, the way housekeepers sometimes are in photographs the families who employ them will later wish had been cropped. Christopher Shriver Schwarzenegger was born on September 11, 1997, the youngest of the 4 Shriver Schwarzenegger children. 5 days later, on October 2, 1997, the housekeeper gave birth, in that same household, to a son. The 2 boys were raised in the same building. The housekeeper continued to be employed. The arrangement would remain hidden from the public for about 13.5 years. It is worth pausing on the word arrangement, because the words that get used later, affair, secret, scandal, are too small for what was actually being run. A household is a system. A household with a long-term housekeeper and 4 small children, and a governor's schedule, and a network correspondence schedule, and a bodyguard schedule, is a system built around who knows what and when. For more than 13 years, the people inside the system knew a fact that the woman at the center of the system did not. The housekeeper herself, in later accounts, has described a slow recognition as the boy grew. The governor himself has described a similar recognition in his own accounts in the years since. Both accounts come from people with obvious reasons to shape what gets said. The undisputed public facts are the ones a court and a county would recognize: a birth certificate, a date, a place of employment, 20 years on a payroll, 5 days between 2 births in the same house. The image of the marriage that most people in America carried through those years was built precisely out of the years this was happening. Christmas cards, magazine covers, the kind of family photo layout that used to be a point of pride and has since become a kind of exhibit. The image is not false. The image is, however, a frame around a fact the frame did not include. The structural collapse of the public arrangement began on August 6, 2003, on the couch of The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. Gray Davis was still governor of California. The recall was on the ballot. Arnold Schwarzenegger announced on live television that he was going to run. In his own account, given to the Hollywood Foreign Press Association the following year, and reported by the Los Angeles Times, he told his wife at home before the announcement, and she started shaking and crying. His mother-in-law talked her around. A few weeks later, Maria Shriver took unpaid leave from NBC News to run the communications operation for his campaign. They had been married for 17 years. She had been a network journalist for 20. The two roles were now the same role. On October 2, 2003, exactly 6 years to the day after the housekeeper's son had been born, the Los Angeles Times published its first story about 6 women who said that, over 3 decades on movie sets and in studio offices, Arnold Schwarzenegger had touched them without consent. One of the women, describing an incident from the 1980s, was quoted in the paper this way: "Did he rape me? No. Did he humiliate me? You bet I did." 2 days later, the same paper ran a second story with 3 more women. The election was 5 days away. Schwarzenegger appeared on camera the same day and apologized. Over the next several days, his campaign said that some of the women's accounts were false. On October 3rd, in Newport Beach, at a lunch for the California Women's Leadership Association, Maria Shriver stood in front of a microphone and called her husband an A+ human being. She would not be standing there, she said, if he were not. To the reporters waiting outside, she repeated the line she had told her own children, that it takes great courage to stand up in front of everyone and apologize. He won the recall by about 1 million votes. The state of California, by about 1 million votes, had made its decision. It is worth saying again that the decision Maria Shriver was making in Newport Beach was being made into a vacuum that was, at the very same moment, being filled by a paid suppression operation she did not know existed. David Pecker, the chief executive of American Media, testified under oath in April of 2024 in the Donald Trump hush money trial in New York that he had entered into arrangements with women whose stories could have reached the Schwarzenegger campaign in 2002 and 2003. Pecker described his company's spending on suppressing Schwarzenegger stories as hundreds of thousands of dollars, and said that between 30 and 40 women had approached American Media after the candidacy was announced. A contract with a Malibu woman named Gigi Goyette, dated August 8, 2003, 2 days after the Leno couch, paid $20,000 for the exclusive rights to her account. A friend of hers signed a similar agreement for $1,000 in cash. American Media had already run a story 2 years earlier describing a long relationship between Goyette and Schwarzenegger during his marriage. Schwarzenegger denied the affair. His communications director said the governor did not know about the contracts. Schwarzenegger himself had, separately, an executive editor's deal with American Media's fitness magazines, reported as worth as much as $8 million, and as a relationship that ended when the deal became public. California regulated the supplement industry advertised in those pages. These are public facts, in court records and campaign filings, and on the front pages of newspapers. They describe a particular kind of architecture. What the architecture bought was 5 days of clean news in October of 2003, and they used the days they bought. The marriage, at this point, was a working machine. Inside it, on the side that no one outside could see, the household was still the household it had always been. The 4 children were being raised in it. The housekeeper was still in it. The youngest of the 4 children was 6. The housekeeper's son was also 6. They were about a year apart in age, and they were in the same rooms. In November of 2003, Arnold Schwarzenegger was sworn in as the 38th governor of California. Maria Shriver, at 48, returned briefly to Dateline. On February 3, 2004, she issued a statement asking to be relieved of her duties at NBC News. The network's president had not asked her to resign. The decision came out of conversations with him and other journalists about whether the First Lady of California could credibly report the news. The decision ended a career she had built without her family's help. The decision was, on paper, hers. He had kept his career. She had given up hers. For the next 7 years, she would build on his career, and she would build something of her own beside it. And the two things would look, from a distance, like the same thing. The California Governor and First Lady's Conference on Women would grow into a major institution. The Minerva Awards would be created in 2004, named for the figure on the California state seal. The Shriver Report, commissioned in 2009, would document that American women were now half the workforce. She would executive produce HBO's The Alzheimer's Project and win 2 Emmys for it, in part because her father, Sergeant Shriver, had been diagnosed with the disease. He would govern as a Republican who broke with his party on climate, on stem cells, on immigration. People close to him would say that the breaks were visible, that the influence at his dinner table was the influence of a Democrat. He would joke about it, often and publicly. The line about a Democrat at his dinner table became a small set piece in his public performances. None of it, the building or the breaking, would change the fact that for 13 and a half years, the household she ran had been organized around a fact she did not have. The 7 years after the recall are the years the marriage is remembered for. They were also the 7 years that cost her the most. She returned briefly to Dateline after the November inauguration in 2003. The arrangement lasted a few weeks. On February 3, 2004, she issued a statement asking to be relieved of her duties at NBC News. The network's president had not asked for her resignation. The decision followed conversations with him and with other journalists about whether the First Lady of California could credibly sit in a network chair and report the news. She was 48. The move ended a career she had built over about 25 years without her family's help. The decision was, on paper, hers. It is also true that it was not really a decision in the way the word decision implies. A reporter who is married to a sitting governor does not get to keep a network chair on the merits of her reporting. The chair becomes a piece of political furniture, and the network knows it, and the reporter knows the network knows it. She had spent the campaign on unpaid leave. The chair was the price of the campaign. The campaign had been his, the chair had been hers. She rebuilt on his career the way most political spouses do when they have no chair of their own. The California Governor and First Lady's Conference on Women became a major annual event. By 2010, it was drawing more than 30,000 attendees and a speaker list that ran from Oprah Winfrey to the Dalai Lama. In 2004, she created the Minerva Awards, named for the goddess on the California state seal. In 2009, she commissioned the Shriver Report, a piece of research that documented, in plain language, that American women were now half the workforce. She executive produced HBO's The Alzheimer's Project and won 2 Emmys for it, work she had taken on in large part because her father, Sergeant Shriver, was already deep into the disease. The political partnership was visible in the same years. Schwarzenegger governed as a Republican who broke with his party on climate, on stem cell research, on immigration. The people around him said the breaks showed a Democrat at the dinner table. He told the joke himself, often, in speeches. The joke was a small piece of the public Arnold, and it was true enough that it stayed funny. Then, inside a stretch of about 18 months, the structure came down around her. Her mother died in August of 2009. Her father, who had Alzheimer's, died in January of 2011, within days of the end of his son-in-law's second term as governor. The Conference on Women ended. The long-term housekeeper retired that same January after roughly 20 years in the household. For the first time since she was 21, Maria Shriver was a private person. No title, no assignment, no chair, no mother. No father in office with a calendar that put her on a stage. No housekeeper whose retirement removed, quietly, the visible form of an arrangement that still had 13 and a half years on the clock. She began, in her own later telling, to ask questions. Multiple accounts of the employee's account, published after the fact, described the answers as having come from the employee first. Confirmation from her husband came in a joint therapist session in early 2011. He had been saying out loud in the years since that he had waited to tell her. He said the same thing in 3 separate settings, almost word for word. He said it on 60 Minutes with Leslie Stahl. He said it in his 2012 memoir, Total Recall, where he called it the stupidest thing I did in his relationship with her. He said it again in the Netflix documentary Arnold in 2023, where, on the subject of the 2003 allegations, he dropped every hedge he had ever used. It was wrong. Forget the excuses. The framing has stayed consistent for more than a decade. He was out of office, and so he told her. The confession was timed to his calendar, not to hers. On May 9, 2011, the separation was announced in a joint statement to the Los Angeles Times. The statement was a sentence. The sentence did not name the reason. About a week later, the same paper published the reason. Schwarzenegger issued a statement of his own. The statement contained no excuses. It carried full responsibility. It apologized to Maria, to his children, and to his family. It said he was truly sorry. Maria's spokesperson asked for comment, had no comment. On July 1, 2011, Maria Shriver filed for divorce. She cited irreconcilable differences. She did not list a separation date. She did not attach a declaration. She filed no allegations. She did not leak. She did not sell an exclusive. She did not write a book. The divorce docket then went, in the public record, almost completely silent for about 10 years. A case filed in Los Angeles in July of 2011 did not move in any way the public could see until the summer of 2021. The quietness of that decade is worth understanding. Almost no divorce of this size in California has ever stayed sealed for 10 years by accident. The estate was large. The filing was clean. The wife did not seek publicity. The husband could afford not to need it. The legal fees, the appraisals, the schedule of properties, the custodial arrangements for 4 children, the existence of a 5th child whose legal standing had to be worked through without anyone outside the small circle knowing, all of that takes time, and takes paperwork, and takes private judges. It also takes 2 people who want, at some level, the same thing. Whatever else they both wanted the courtroom proceedings to stay out of the news. There is another way to read the quietness, and it is the one the rest of this story will rest on. A decade in which nothing about the marriage enters the public record through a courthouse is a decade in which the story of the marriage is told by the people who choose to tell it. He chose to tell his, in 3 successive tellings: the book, the Sunday night interview, the documentary. She, in those same years, did not. The decision not to narrate is itself a form of narration. Filing a divorce with no separation date, and no declaration, and no allegations is the legal equivalent of a sealed door. It does not, of course, change what is on the other side of it. It does change what the public is allowed to know about what is on the other side of it. And that is, in this family, the only thing that has ever been allowed to be controlled. In the spring of 2011, inside the therapist's office, a marriage that had been one of the most photographed in the United States for a quarter of a century ended in a conversation between 2 people. Neither of them, in any public statement either has ever made, has described what was said in that room. He has described, on national television and in a memoir that made him more money than his first 3 films combined, the contours of why he had done what he had done. He has described what he told her, in summary. He has described the way his chest felt when he watched her face as the words came out. He has not described her. He has described his experience of her, which is a different thing. She, in the 15 years since, has declined, in every public setting that has offered itself, to describe him. The California divorce file was a long piece of quiet. It sat in a courthouse in Los Angeles for about 10 years, without moving in any way a member of the public could observe. And the public explanation for that length was the usual one: complexity of assets. The couple had no prenuptial agreement. They were in a community property state. Between them they held, at the end of the marriage, something on the order of $400 million in film money, in real estate, and in the smaller business interests of a man who had been one of the highest-grossing movie stars in the world for 2 decades, and then had been governor of the largest state in the Union for 7 more years. A private judge was appointed in November of 2021. A sitting judge signed the final paperwork on December 28th of the same year. The terms were sealed. Neither party sought spousal support. Neither side filed a hostile document. The case file, in legal terms, was, from the summer of 2011 to the close of 2021, essentially a closed envelope. A closed envelope is its own kind of story. A decade in which nothing about a marriage enters the public record through a courthouse is a decade in which the marriage belongs, in the court of public opinion, to whoever is willing to speak about it on their own terms. He had been speaking about it, in 3 books worth of stage time, for almost that entire decade. She had not. The quietness was not his to use, it was hers. While the file sat, she rebuilt. NBC brought her back in 2013 as a special anchor on her own terms, covering the subjects she chose, in the formats she chose, with a contract that gave her a production role in what she made. That arrangement was less a job than a way back to the chair she had given up 9 years earlier, except this time, the chair came with the agenda attached to it, and the agenda was hers. Out of that agenda came the women's Alzheimer's movement, an organizing effort she built from her father's work, which had once been a kitchen table fight with a senator's office about research funding, and which became, by the end of the decade, a coalition under the Cleveland Clinic. The coalition had a number, a paper, and a research budget. The number was the count of women in the United States living with the disease. The paper documented the gap between what was being spent on men and what was being spent on women. The budget moved money. She also launched a Sunday newsletter, then a media company around it, then a body of work that, by the time it had been publicly built, was its own operation. Own audience, own platform, own revenue, no husband attached. She wrote a book in 2018 that landed on bestseller lists and stayed there for a season. The book was not the divorce book the tabloids had been waiting for, and would wait for in vain until 2025. It was a different kind of book. She also, in this period, describes in her own later telling a retreat at a cloistered convent. A nun named Mother Dolores spent time with her. The framing the nun offered, that what Maria had really been looking for was permission to leave her marriage and be Maria, is its own piece of the story. The woman who had spent 25 years building a broadcast career on a network stage, who had then been First Lady of California for 7 years, who had then been the silent party to a sealed divorce for 10 more, was being told, by a person she had gone to find inside a wall, that she had not yet become her own first name. She began to write poems. The first poems were private. They stayed private for years. They came out on April 1st, 2025, under the title I Am Maria, in a book that the publisher described as the closest thing to a memoir she has published. The book is, in fact, a poetry book with a long essay at the end. The essay is not a tell-all. The book is not a tell-all. The book has, in the middle of it, a single line that tells the reader, in plain language, what the book is not going to be. Much has been written about the end of my marriage, and I don't feel I need or want to discuss it here or anywhere. The line does the work of a sealed divorce file. It is a closed envelope in print. The poems themselves are sharper than the line. The marriage, she writes, broke my heart, broke my spirit, broke what was left of me. Without the marriage, without her parents, without the job she had built and then given up, the dam of a lifelong denial gave way. There is a poem, or a passage, in which she describes sitting on a hotel room floor in the dark, terrified, telling herself that it did not have to be the end of her. There is a poem in which one of her mistakes, she says, was tying her own self-worth to her own achievements. There is a poem in which another mistake was believing that someone outside herself could guarantee her safety. None of these lines are written about a man. They are written about a woman who has decided, after 25 years of public marriage and 10 years of private divorce, that what she is willing to put on a page is the inside of her own thinking and not the inside of someone else's. This is editorial control. It is also the family craft. The Kennedys' longest-running public skill has not been the leak or the tell-all. It has been the patient placement of what gets said. The placements are sometimes badly miscalculated. The instinct, what is held back, what is allowed to be seen, what is offered in exchange for what is concealed, is almost always calculated. In 2025, she calculated it again, in poetry, in a book that opened with a refusal. The book landed the way a book lands when a reader had been told, for 15 years, that the author would, eventually, narrate the ending of her marriage. The reader had been told this by her husband, in a memoir, in a televised interview, in a Netflix documentary, in stand-up routines that often return to the same confession. The reader had been told it by the tabloids, by the houses of American media, by the paid contract machinery that had kept the story at arm's length in 2003 and that had been paid to keep it at arm's length again later. The reader had been waiting, in other words, a long time for the other side of what is, in public imagination, the most photographed divorce of the century. The reader got poems. The poems are not nothing. The poems are a serious body of work, written by a woman in her late 60s, about the cost of a life in public and the work of becoming a private person again. The poems are the answer to a question the public had been asking out loud for 15 years, and the answer is that the question has been declined. Not on grounds of legal exposure or settlement terms, on grounds of taste. On grounds of what a woman who has been a journalist, a first lady, a daughter of a family that knew exactly what kind of damage a tell-all can do, has decided the inside of her own life is worth being used for? The answer is hers. In the tabloid economy she was supposed to publish. The tabloid economy had paid, in real American dollars, to keep her story out of the marketplace in 2003. She had refused the marketplace then, in her own way, by standing at a microphone in Newport Beach and calling her husband an A+ human being. She is refusing the marketplace now, in a different way, by publishing a poetry book that does not narrate him. The decade of sealed filings produced, in the end, 2 open books. His is the one that was always going to be written. Hers is the one no one thought she would write, because the story the public was waiting for from her was the story of him. The marriage was not a fraud. It is necessary to say this in a story that has, in the last 4 parts, taken the structure of a public arrangement apart in some detail. The fact that a marriage ran alongside a fact the wife did not know does not, by itself, mean the marriage was not real. The marriage lasted 25 years. It produced 4 children. It produced a body of photographs, including ones taken as recently as 2020, on his birthday, with all 4 children standing between the 2 of them. There is documented closeness in that record, and the documentation is not produced by either of them. It is produced by the people who watched them move through 25 years of dinners and holidays and school functions and parent-teacher nights and sick children and recovered children and political campaigns. The 5th child, born in October of 1997, an adult by the time of the Netflix documentary in 2023, working in a career of his own, has spoken warmly of his mother. The governor has, in his own time and on his own terms, been publicly involved with the boy's life. None of this is the language of fraud. It is the language of a family that was, in important ways, a family, even if a piece of it was hidden from the woman who was running the household. The marriage is better described, with the public record in hand, as a merger that worked spectacularly for one party and was paid for, mostly, by the other. The asymmetry is the story. He got the Kennedy name, the Democratic wife, the family address book, and the credibility those things carried in California in 2003. That credibility, in the public record, is the reason he won the recall by about 1 million votes 5 days after the Los Angeles Times published its first story about women who said he had touched them without consent. He also got 7 years of governing, a second term, a body of work as governor that included pieces of policy his party did not endorse and that his mother-in-law's table helped him think through. He also got, on top of all that, the arrangement that kept the most damaging stories about his private life out of the newspapers during the campaign. She got a husband she had chosen with her eyes open at 21. 4 children she had carried and raised, 7 years of being talked about as the most influential first lady California had had in a generation, and the loss of a career she had built without her family's help. She gave up the network chair at 48. She rebuilt on his career and then on her own. She held the 4 children together, in public and in private, through a separation announced in May of 2011 and through a divorce that did not finalize until late December of 2021. She did not narrate any of it. The protective machinery, the tabloid arrangements in 2003, the paid contracts described in the Trump trial testimony in 2024, the household arrangement itself, kept from the wife for 13.5 years, was pointed in one direction. The machinery protected the man who was going to run for governor, and the machinery was paid for by his side of the deal. The wife did not know about the contracts in 2003, did not learn about the 5th child until early 2011, did not seek spousal support in the divorce, did not write the tell-all the tabloid economy had been waiting for, and did not narrate him in the poetry book in 2025. The Hyannis church steps come back into the story at this point, because the rest of it is the rest of it. April 26, 1986, St. Francis Xavier, Caroline Kennedy in the party, Franco Colombo at his side, Oprah Winfrey as the reader, Andy Warhol with a camera, 500 guests. The photographs are in the Warhol Photography Archive at Stanford. The Waldheim toast happened at the reception that evening. The picture that those documents make, when one looks at them all together, is a portrait of a transfer. A family handing over its most valuable asset, a daughter who had learned the news business in Philadelphia, in Baltimore, on her own at CBS and then at NBC, to a man who understood that the news business was the credential he did not yet have in the country he had come to. The transaction had a bride in it, and the bride was not a prop in the transaction. The bride was, however, the part of the transaction that did not know yet what she was being exchanged for. He learned the room. He had already learned it. He learned it again in 2003, on a couch at NBC, when his mother-in-law's network of donors and volunteers produced a majority in a recall election for a man whose name had been on the front page of the Los Angeles Times that week for a different reason. He learned the room again, 15 years later, in the studio where the Netflix documentary Arnold was made, when he said, in his own voice, that he had been wrong and the qualifications were over. He has been saying it out loud, in his own voice, on his own schedule, for 15 years. She learned something different. She learned that the room, in this family, has never belonged to the person who talks the loudest. It belongs to the person who decides what the room is going to be about. He chose, every time, to put the room on him. She chose, every time she had the chance, to put the room on something else. The poetry book, in 2025, is the last and cleanest example. The room, in that book, is her interior. He is not in it. The marriage produced 4 children who are out in the world. They have their own names and their own careers. They are not part of this story, except as the reason both of these people, almost certainly, have learned to behave in public the way they have. Arnold Schwarzenegger wrote the memoir. He sat for the interview with Leslie Stahl. He made the documentary. He has said the words out loud and has been saying them for 15 years. He has also, in the same 15 years, continued to coach, to mentor, to advise, to show up at the birthday and the holiday, to be photographed with his 4 older children, to be a presence in the life of his 5th child. Maria Shriver published the poetry book on April 1, 2025, in which she declined, in plain language, to discuss the end of her marriage in print or anywhere else. The closed envelope holds. She has also, in the same 15 years, returned to a network chair on her own terms, built an independent media company, built a national women's Alzheimer's coalition that moved under the Cleveland Clinic, and published a bestseller in 2018. She has been seen, when she has been seen, at family events with him, in the kind of appearance that is itself part of the family's story management. The story, in its final form, is not the tabloid story. The tabloid story required her to speak, and she has not spoken. The story is not the redemption story either. Redemption requires the wife to forgive in public, and she has not done that either. The story is the record of a transaction that ran for 25 years and was settled in court in late December of 2021, with no sealed filing reopened and no term of the settlement released. 2 publishing records, 15 years of his, 1 poetry book, a sealed file, and the rest of her life, of hers. The viewer is left with the picture in the archive at Stanford and the poem on the page in 2025, and with the thought that the quieter of the 2 people in this marriage may have been the one who understood the original deal at Hyannis better than the groom did, including the groom himself.